There's an argument to be made that Spurs are the most interesting club in the Premier League heading into the summer transfer window, because although they experienced an injury crisis which exposed a lack of squad depth and left them just above the relegation spots, they also squeaked into the Champions League through the Europa League, which will give them a windfall of revenue next season. So they have problems to fix, but they also have the money to do it. And on top of all this, they have a new manager in Thomas Frank, which means there's a little bit of uncertainty about how they'll be setting up by the time the summer comes to an end. This is sensible transfers, where we look for weaknesses in squads and identify solutions to those problems. Remember, this is not what we think the clubs will do, it's what we think they should do. We're going to focus on a few areas where Spurs can improve their squad, but before we do that, we have to ask the question, how is Frank going to be using this squad in the first place? Across his time at Brentford, the best way to describe Frank's approach is probably adaptable. Not only has he shifted between different structures, developing a team who are comfortable moving between back four and back three shapes, but he's also built a team where the players are comfortable switching between different strategies depending on the opponent. Over the last couple of seasons, Frank has attempted to evolve the team into a playstyle that he's called Brentford 2.0, which is a more controlled and dominant version of what they had been playing when the club were mainly focused on escaping relegation. In fact, across the second part of the season just ended, he had Brentford playing in a way that actually suits Spurs' squad quite nicely. Starting from a back four with a double pivot in front of them, Frank had his team engaging in deep build-up to give the forwards time to generate favourable conditions to have a shift of tempo, which could result in direct attacks. By having the striker and the number 10 abandoning the opposition's defensive line, they then create space that can be exploited by fullbacks or wingers making out-to-in runs, prompting the players in deeper areas to try and find them. So let's assume that Frank will be working with a back four, a double pivot in front of them, strikers and 10s who can drop deep and receive the ball, and then wingers who can run into space out-to-in behind them. And if we do that, we end up with something like this. In attack, the front three positions can be filled up quite nicely. On the right, Spurs have two players in Dejan Kulusevski and Brennan Johnson who can match the in-behind running and link-up play of Bryan Mbeumo. And over on the left, Matis Tel, who's just signed a permanent contract, and Heung-min Son, if he stays at the club, both suit the more flexible inside role played by Kevin Schade for Brentford this season, where he rotates with a more advanced fullback in a bid to create space that one or other can then exploit. Of course, there are questions to be raised about how this dynamic changes when Spurs come up against deeper blocks. They do have Wilson Odobert, who offers 1v1 threat on either side of the pitch, but this remains an area of concern going forward unless they decide to drop a big fee on one of the outstanding talents in the market. In the centre forward position, Dominic Solanke is perfect for Thomas Frank. He can play off the shoulder of the last man, but he's also very good at dropping deep and linking up play, which will create space in behind for his teammates. Richarlison offers a different profile in that position, as does Tel, who can also play more centrally, so another centre forward is probably not on the cards this summer. Which brings us to the first real area of need for Spurs this window, the attacking midfielder spot. At this point, Spurs only really have James Maddison, who works in this position, which is concerning for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Spurs had to rotate him fairly carefully last season to protect him from a physical point of view. But perhaps more importantly, the number 10 role in Frank's Brentford team last season was the beating heart of the team, the player through which everything flowed. We've already said that Brentford have a double pivot, whose job is to help the team in deep build-up. Beyond this, the two pivots have tended to have slightly different profiles, with one of them being a bit more of a stopper, and the other one having a box-to-box role in games where they have more possession. But despite being involved in deep build-up, neither of these two players offer a huge amount of ball progression. But it's also because the majority of the ball progression that happened in the midfield area was done by the number 10 Mikkel Damsgaard. Damsgaard's abandoning of the opposition's back line isn't just to create space for his teammates to attack, it's for him to drop out and contribute to build-up, receiving the ball generally on the left-hand side and then helping Brentford to shift the ball quickly in those moments where they change tempo. Maddison will be perfect for this role. Not only does he have the final third creativity necessary for a number 10, but he can also drop deep and contribute to ball progression. But considering his physical issues and more European football next season, Spurs will be wise to bring in a backup in this kind of area. Now, there are a few options that they could take here. For instance, given that they're looking for a backup, they could go for an older player who would be happy with reduced minutes. Someone like Kevin Sturger at Borussia Mönchengladbach, who is a nice profile fit and, at 31 years old, is already playing a relatively reduced role for his club. However, given that Spurs have been given a boost of revenue from the Champions League, the better option here is probably to bring in a younger player who can develop into the role behind Maddison. And while playing a backup role might not be too appealing to a young up-and-comer, it's worth noting that Maddison missed out on a possible 1,300 minutes last season. So with Spurs having Champions League football next season, this should very much be considered as a rotation option. Recently relegated sides are often a good source of young, gettable talent, and there are a couple of options on the market from teams who dropped out of the Premier League last season. Mateus Fernandes is an exciting option who put up good good numbers in Portugal before signing for Southampton last summer. This season, he regularly played as the most advanced midfielder in a 3 and often dropped deeper to help in build-up. However, although he put up pretty good progressive numbers for a player at a relegated side, he's still a little way off the sort of output that Damsgaard produce, and certainly doesn't put up enough line-breaking passes at this point. Of course, it's likely that he would scale up his output at a better side, and he would develop his progressive game as time went by. But there's another player who got relegated from the Premier League who's further ahead in his development in this area. Leicester City's Belal El Khanous. El Khanous is another attacking midfielder who likes to drop deep in build-up, and he plays the role very similarly to the way that Damsgaard does. So you can see here he's about to drop deep and drag the defender with him, and once he's laid the ball off, he then moves out into space to be able to receive the ball and then help progress it. Now, his progressive numbers were higher than Matheus Fernandes this season, but what's actually interesting here is how much his data matches Maddison's. And it's worth noting that his progressive passing was through the roof when he was playing in the Belgian Pro League the season before, which suggests that he could scale his output upwards at a better side. El Khanous is contracted till 2028, but it could be the case that he has some kind of relegation clause in that contract, and Leicester City are likely to be in need of money this summer, which is why he's my pick for Spurs backup number 10. Elsewhere in the squad, the picture is quite interesting. On the one hand, the Spurs squad seems well constructed to play Thomas Frank's tactics, but there are some areas where they could use more depth, either to protect themselves from future injury crises or to give themselves more tactical flexibility further down the line. Let's start with the back line. As you can see, Spurs have relatively good depth to play a back 4. But although Brentford line up in a 4, Frank will sometimes use a centre-back as a fullback, which means you can push the opposite side fullback further up the pitch, and then you end up with this situational back 3. Even with this requirement, Spurs probably have just enough players to get through, especially with Ben Davies signing a contract extension earlier this month. But even with him being able to fill in any of these positions on the left, Spurs are still a little bit thin on the ground when it comes to left centre-back depth behind Mickey van de Ven, who missed 32 games last season, which is why I think a sensible transfer for Spurs this season would be Arthur Theat of Eintracht Frankfurt. Not only would he offer centre-back depth, but he's also spent much of his career playing as a fullback, which means he could rotate with Destiny Udogie, whilst offering a perfect outside centre-back option if Frank wanted to push the fullback on the other side. Now, Theat is on a 2029 contract, so he wouldn't come cheap, but he's still eminently affordable for a club with Champions League revenue heading their way. The midfield area is also somewhere where Spurs could make improvements this summer, because although we've already said that Frank's Brentford used the more advanced midfielder to do a lot of the ball progression, it would still be advantageous if he had the option of a progressive passer in the double pivot itself. And right now he doesn't, with most of Spurs midfielders being ball carriers rather than passers. At Brentford, Frank has used Christian Norgod on the right side of that double pivot, playing him as more of a stopper, but with the ability to progress the ball through passing. That's because Damsgaard tends to drop out on the other side, which means that Norgod has a bit more responsibility to advance the ball on the right. So if Spurs could find a similar profile to Norgod, a defensive option with good progressive passing numbers, then Thomas Frank will have a much better range of tactical options within his double pivot. Which is why I think that Spurs should try and sign Manuel Locatelli. Locatelli is the perfect profile fit here. Both his progressive passing numbers and his defensive numbers are excellent, and he has a lot of experience playing in a double pivot across his career. With him on the right hand side, Spurs could then rotate the other pivot around depending on what the game required, either pairing him with a more defensive option or with one of their ball carrying profiles. The only concerns with Locatelli would be contractual. At 27 years old, with a couple of years left on his contract, he's absolutely ripe for the final big contract of his career, especially with Juventus going through a bit of upheaval at the moment. Spurs also might have reservations about spending big money on a player of that age, but they did have the third youngest squad in the Premier League season just gone, so they could probably absorb an older player into the mix. All of which makes Locatelli my sensible transfer pick for Spurs midfield. So these are my sensible transfers for Spurs, and this is what they would look like if I was in charge after the summer. If you want to find out more about what's going on in the transfer window, why not check out the deal sheet on the Athletics website, or why not tune into the dedicated deal sheet shows that are running on the Athletics Week in Football across the summer. Bye!
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.